This is lesson 6.3, General Applications of Percent in Pre-Algebra. And up until this point, we have been doing the changing of percents to numbers and numbers to percent using the word is and of as an equal and a multiplication sign, and doing things like what percent of 42 is 21, where you would write what percent of times 42 is equals 21, and you would find your x there. Well, in this section we're given story problems, and within those story problems we're supposed to make an equation that looks like that we did in 6.2 in order to solve this. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because I'm asking you to take a story problem and rewrite it in algebraic form. So, for example, example 1 says we've got this 120 question test. So there's 120 questions. And a student answered 96 questions correctly. So we'll just put, if you can read my writing, 96 questions correct. What percentage of the problems did the student work correctly? So we've got this two-sentence story problem, and we need to write it in a way that we can go ahead and solve it. So what do we know here? We know that we have 96 questions out of 120 answered correctly. So 96 out of 120. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take those two numbers and put those in an equation with our unknown. And that's the way these are generally going to be. They're going to have two numbers in the story problem, and then there's a third number that you're trying to come up with, just like in lesson 6.2. So what we're interested in is what percentage of the problems did the student work correctly? Well, he got 96 out of 120 correct. So 96 is what percent of the 120? So if we were to write that, we would write 96 is what percent of 120. See what we've got there? 96 out of 120 were correct, and they're wanting to know what that 96 is as far as a percentage goes. So then we can write this as 96 equals what percent of times 120, and then we can go ahead and solve that. So again, we're not working with percentages, so we're just going to erase that, and we'll go from there. So we're going to take our 120 and divide both sides by 120. Those go away, and we have 96 over 120, which is 0.80. And then we turn this into a percent by moving the decimal over 2 to the right, and we get 80%. So if a student gets 96 out of 120 correct, that would be 80% correct. In example 2, we're doing it a little bit different. We've got this bottle of hydrochloric acid, HCl, and it has 60 milliliters of liquid in the bottle. And I know that of that 60 milliliters, 80% of that is HCl, hydrochloric acid. So I want to know how much of that 60 is hydrochloric acid. Sure, 80% is, but how do you pour 80%? So I need to know how many milliliters is hydrochloric acid. So I can say 40 milliliters out of the 60 is hydrochloric acid, etc. So if the bottle is marked 80% hydrochloric acid. That means 80% of the 60 milliliters is hydrochloric acid, which means that this is what I'm looking for. And I'm just going to put milliliters there so I know that I'm looking for a liquid measure here. So I just looked at the story problem and came up with that. 80% of the 60 milliliters is what I'm looking for. So then I go ahead and change my 80% to a decimal, because remember, I can't use my percentages in math. I have to change it to a decimal first, and then if necessary change it back. And that equals that. So 80.8 times 60 is 48, and that's what my x equals. So 48 milliliters out of the 60 milliliters in the bottle is going to be hydrochloric acid. So that's 80%, and it also gives me an opportunity to determine how much of that liquid in volume is going to be hydrochloric acid. Now let's look at example 3. We have 48% of the students in a college, 48% are female. And there's 2,400 female students. So they want to know what is the total number of students in the college. So 48% of the student body. So 48% of times the total student body are female. And that is 48% of that total is 2,400 students. So 48% of the total are 2,400 female students. So there's our problem set up that way. So now we're going to change this to a decimal first, times the total equals 2,400. Now we're going to divide by 0.48 because of this multiplication sign there. Those go away. So 2,400 divided by 0.48 gives us the total number of students. And we find out that there are 5,000 when we do this division there. So 5,000 students. Alright, so let's look at this real quick. 48% of this 5,000 students are female, which means a little less than half, which is where we got the 2,400. So 2,400 out of the 5,000 total are female, which means there are 48% female. In example 4, 25% of elementary algebra students get an A. And there are 300 students enrolled in algebra this year. So what does that 300 represent? That represents all of the students that are taking the class. Now, out of that 300 students, 25% get an A. So let's see what they're asking. How many students will receive A's? So what they're saying is, sure, 25% of the students will get an A. There are 300 students total, but what is the number of students? 25% of the total would give me the total number of students getting an A. So if I just want to know the A students, I'm going to go 25% of the total students get A's. So 25% of that is going to give me the number of students who get A's. And again, we have to change that to a decimal. So 0.25 times 300 equals the number of students who get A's. So 0.25 times 300 is 75. So 25% of 300 is going to be 75 students. So there's 75 students that are going to be getting A's in elementary algebra. And lastly, for example 5, we've got a story problem dealing with trash. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, Americans generated 250 million tons of trash. I'm just going to write 250. They recycled over 85 million tons. Now, if I was not doing a million tons in both the 250 and the 85, I'd have to write out 85 million and 250 million. But since they're both millions, I can just write it as 250 and 85 and not have to worry about it. Alright, so they recycled over 85 million tons of this material. What percentage of the trash was recycled? So what I'm interested in is 85 out of the 250 total was recycled. I want to know this percentage here. 85 out of the 250. That would give me my percentage. So 85 is what percent of the 250? That's what I'm looking for. So going ahead and writing this out, 85 is what percent of 250? Divide by 250. Those go away. 85 divided by 250 is 0.34. Changing that to a percent, since that's what they're asking us to do, is give us the percent. We have 34%. So, in other words, 85 out of 250 tons was recycled. 85 is 34%. So 34% of the garbage was recycled. And that's how you do example 5.